Hi there, I'm Melissa from polkadotchair.com and welcome to week 3 of the Spooky Shelfie Quilt Along. This week we're going to be making the pumpkin blocks. There are 3 different sizes of pumpkin blocks in the quilt and a couple of slight variations of each of the blocks. I'm going to show you on this row. This is a good example of some of the blocks in the quilt. We have small pumpkin blocks, what I'm calling a tall pumpkin block, and then your medium-sized pumpkin blocks. The tall and the medium pumpkin blocks, I always get so tongue-tied when I try and name all these blocks out for you guys, but the tall and the medium pumpkin blocks are made up of striped fabrics, and then the smallest pumpkin block is just made up of a single piece of fabric. You have half square triangles for the leaves and then some rectangles and squares for the stems. I'm going to walk you through making one of the pumpkin blocks, and I will share with you one of my tips for creating the block. The pumpkins kind of have a little bit of a round shape thanks to a technique in quilting that's commonly referred to as stitch and flip. Sometimes it's referred to as snowballing a corner. So each of these pumpkins have a snowballed corner, and I'm going to share with you one of my tips for getting a straight 45-degree angle on those snowball corners. It's a little bit unconventional. Some of you may like it, some of you may not, but it's, as somebody that is kind of a self-taught quilter, it's something that's really helped me as I've been going by making these pumpkin blocks. So let's move this quilt out of the way and start sewing. All right, before we get going, we're going to cover a couple of housekeeping items. We talked about the pumpkin blocks in the quilt. They begin on page 9. Under each of the cutting instructions for the pumpkin blocks, it tells you how many pumpkin blocks are in the quilt. And so in this case, there's 3 medium pumpkin blocks, and the cutting directions tell you that it yields 3 blocks. So you don't need to repeat this 3 times, you just need to cut this out as shown to get 3 blocks. I'm going to walk you through I'm going to walk you through the construction for the tall pumpkin block. I have a fun bonus project, a freebie to share with you guys at the end to use with your leftover scraps. So I am going to be making a couple of the blocks from the quilt. I'm going to try and make them all 12.5 inches tall, and then I'll show you what I'm going to do with them. So anyway, the tall pumpkin block is 6.5 by 12.5 before finishing. I'm just going to follow the directions in the pattern as it's noted. And then I did one thing for you guys. I realized this should be an X, not a Z. It has been fixed. But one of those things that I wish I had realized when I was writing the pattern, but sometimes ideas don't come until later. So anyway, I have made a fabric key for all of you. If you want to go to my site, to polkadotchair.com, I'll add the address here, so that you know where to go. You can download this fabric key. So this is fabric A, B, C, D, E, etc. If you're using other fabric besides the Spooky Schoolhouse fabric, then you could just cut out a square of it and just glue or staple it to the top of each one of these, so you know where to substitute. So hopefully that should help you as you keep going with the quilt and cutting out your pieces. The first thing I'm going to walk you through while creating this block is creating the half square triangle that's used for the leaves. All of the pumpkin blocks have half square triangles as leaves. Half square triangles are used in a few other spots in the pattern as well. So I'm going to walk you through it this first time, and then I'll refer back to this video in subsequent videos when we have half square triangles that need to be made. So generally when you make a half square triangle, you're going to put 2 squares of fabric right sides facing, draw a line, and then take it to your machine and sew 1/4 inch on both sides of that seam, which is my go-to way. I wanted to show you a tool that I have that you guys might be interested in. It is made by Fons and Potter, and what it is it marks, if you line this up along the corners, then this is 1/4 inch and this is 1/4 inch. So instead of, making sure that your machine foot is exactly at 1/4 inch from your seam, this is just another option. So now when I come in here and mark this, I know instead of marking the center when I sew, excuse me, frog in my throat this week, that I can just sew on the line. So just another option. One thing to keep in mind when you do this is just double check when you mark it. It's correct, and I would probably still, just to be safe, I would sew just a hair on the inside of the line you drew instead of right on the line. So what we're going to do is take this piece and this piece, place them right sides together, take your machine, sew a 1/4 inch on each side. Those lines are sewn. I'm going to take my ruler and my rotary cutter, and I'm just going to cut the 2 pieces in half. Then I'm going to take them over to my iron, and I'm going to press them. We actually only need 1 half square triangle for this block. The other is extra, so I'm just going to set that aside. I like to press it first and then come in and fold that up, pressing towards the darker fabric. And then I have a half square triangle, which is not square. It's kind of wonky. So I like to use the block lock rulers for this. I've shared them quite a bit. The nice thing is that they have a groove down the center so that this will butt up against the seam. And it just makes it so easy to square up your half square triangles. And you definitely need to square them up for this project. Okay, just move that out of the way, and we have our completed half square triangle. We're ready to move on with making additional parts of the block. I'm going to move this out of the way because we don't need it anymore. Those rotating cutting mats are really useful when you're making a lot of half square triangles. It really helps save some time. So moving on to the next step of the pattern, after we've created the half square triangles, we are going to assemble the top of the block, which very straightforward as far as sewing goes. I'm just going to take your pieces, line them up. And it looks like they don't fit together now, but they do once you sew all the seams. So that I'm going to sew together off camera for the top of the block. Set that aside for now. All right, now we're going to cover what is considered snowballing corners, clipping corners. Everyone kind of has a different way of talking about this technique, but it's one that I use a lot. For this technique, you want to get your pen out again and draw a line diagonally on your 2 bottom corner pieces. And I'm using a friction pen. It disappears with heat. It's actually sold in the office section of the store. Alright, so ahead of time I have sewn my 3 rectangles of fabric together, and I did press the seams open because longer seams, kind of stripy looking things, I just think they look better pressed open. And what we're going to do is we're just going to take this piece and this piece and place it along the bottom of the block. You can make sure everything's squared up, and then you're going to sew. You're going to sew on this line, but actually what I prefer to do is come 1 stitch length on the inside of the line, because that will help account for the fold that we're going to make in the fabric and help you get a more squared off corner. And then I'm going to show you a trick if your corner is very not square, of something that you can do. those seams are sewn, and from here there are a couple of things you can do. The way I always used to do it was to take my ruler, trim a 1/4 inch, and then press it down. What I prefer to do now, I just think it just helps you get a little better result, is before I trim, I like to come in and fold that down. Alright, now this one I stitched a little bit off on purpose to show you. So from this point, if you're someone that likes to use a rotary cutter, just come in here with your rotary cutter and your ruler and trim that. But honestly, if I'm doing a bunch of these, I prefer just to use scissors. And I actually will get my big Ginger scissors out for this, and I just trim it off. Because it doesn't have to be perfect, and sometimes it's just easier just to sit and do that instead of the rotary cutter. Okay, so another trick. This trick will depend on how opaque your background fabric is and how dark the fabric underneath is. With this, I think we can get away with it, but it will show through a little bit. So you can see this is off. If I trim this, I'm not going to get a 90-degree angle here. So what I will do sometimes, and I will usually do this if I have a very small clipped corner, like 1 by 1 or less, is I will just trim off the middle. And then you can see here how I still have the original corner from the pink showing through a little bit. So when I go to sew this block to the other blocks next to it, then I know that it's square, versus the other option would be to rip this seam out and sew it again. But that can be tedious if you're making a lot of blocks or doing a lot of clipped corners. Like I said, on this, it shows through a little bit. Obviously wouldn't do this if I was using white fabric with a dark gray or black background fabric or a really large clipped corner. But in this case, I think that it works great, and that it's a great way, especially if you're new, to get a little bit better result until your kind of skills catch up to where you want them to be when it comes to this technique, because a lot of quilt patterns do use this clipping corners technique. The last thing I need to do on this block is sew this top section to the bottom assembled section. I want to point out on the pattern, it does ask you to clip the corners on the strips before you sew the 3 strips together to make the pumpkin. I want to let you know you can do it either way, since none of these corners overlap the next seam. It doesn't matter whether you do it first or second. I just thought I would save a step in explanation to make the video a little briefer by sewing those together beforehand. So just sew that together, and then you have a completed pumpkin block, and the next week we are on to the cauldron and potions blocks.